Today we'll go through some specific functions of modal verbs using Units 49 to 53 of My Grammar Lab. We will also go through some questions in the exercises, and you can choose to pause the video after every unit to complete the exercises, or wait until the end and do them all together. Let's start. Before we go into the specifics, here are some reminders about modal verbs. The shades meter on the left reminds you modal verbs comes in levels. They are used to express levels of possibility, necessity, and obligation. You should also remember that most modal verbs do not change tense. And all of them, when used with a third-person pronoun, do not end with an S. Like we would say he eats, but we never say he cans. And finally, to make modal verbs negative, simply add not. If you can handle these, let's move on to the main dish. The modal verbs must, mustn't, and have to are used to talk about rules. The difference between them is formality. Must is the most formal, have to is less formal, and have got to is casual. As for tenses, the modal verb must doesn't have other tense forms. So we simply change have to into the past and future form like we would for the verb have. When we talk about rules, there's a difference between have to and must. If there's a sign on the wall that tells you to take off your backpack before entering the library, you can tell your friend, "We have to take our backpacks off." But if you are the one giving the rule, you may say you must take off your backpack before you go in. The difference is very slight, and these two are quite interchangeable in reality. So the major difference between them is still formality. And do remember, if you want to talk about rules in the past or the future, you only use the forms of have to. When there are rules telling you not to do something, we do read instructions as, "You mustn't ride your bikes on the grass." But quite often, we simply say, "You can't do something here," or that you are not allowed to do something here. And for these things that you are not allowed to do, we use be allowed to for the past and future forms, such as wasn't allowed to and will not be allowed to. Now take a look at the practice on page 147 of your book. Exercise 1. You have to rearrange the words to make questions or sentences about rules. For question 1, as you can see from the structure in the example, if this was a sentence, the answer would be he has got to wear a uniform. But since there's a question mark, we know we have to change the form to a question, and the answer should be, has he got to wear a uniform? Exercise 2. For question 1, the choices are mustn't be and doesn't have to be. This is a difference we haven't explained yet. If something mustn't be next to a TV, it means that it shouldn't be or that it is not allowed to be. If something doesn't have to be next to a TV, then it's okay for it to be next to the TV, but that is not necessary. And for this question, the second half of the sentence says they may interrupt the signals, which is a bad result if the router is put next to the TV. So we know it is not allowed to be next to a TV, and the answer is mustn't be. Exercise 3. As you proofread the sentences, pay attention to the use of modal verbs. For example, in question 1, we know that all verbs should stay in their base form when they are used after a modal verb. We should not use to infinitives. Therefore, cross out to. Now you may pause the video to complete this page, or continue with the video and do all the exercises all together in the. When we want to say that something is necessary, we simply use the word need like we would use it as a verb. So for things that we have to do, we may also say need to. To talk about unnecessary things in the present and future, simply change the tense of the verb need or have to. But for unnecessary actions in the past, there are two options. If you say something didn't need to happen or didn't have to happen, it means that the action was unnecessary and that it may or may not have happened. But if you say it needn't have happened, you are emphasizing that something did happen, but that it was unnecessary. As you can see from the example on the bottom of the page here, saying Carol needn't have taken a towel means it was unnecessary, but she did take it. If you say Carol didn't need to take a towel, then the action was still unnecessary, but there is no information about whether she took it or not. Now let's look at the practice. Exercise 1. The sentences on the right are very similar, so you have to pay attention to the tense of the verb. An exception is question 1. When you say that your rent is high, then you need to make enough money to pay your rent. Most of the sentences on the right are about taking money, which means taking money from your savings. The only one that means making more money is A. So, exercise 2. For this, you have to match the meaning of the sentences and then write the suitable form of need, meaning the right tense of need, in the blank. Question 1 mentions getting a job. People who need to get a job needs money. From all the options there we see, only D mentions my brother doesn't have any money, so he is the one who needs to get a job. Exercise 3. You have a number of options, but they are just the different tense form of need, so you just have to see which tense fits the sentence better. For question 1, after we've processed the form, there's a next step that is necessary. So the answer should be will need to. Question 2 describes a necessary procedure each new member has to do. It's a fact, so we use the present simple needs to. Now let's talk about using modal verbs to give advice. If you're giving advice in general, just say you should or you ought to do something. Should can also be used to ask for advice, and when you want to give strong advice that you really want the person to take your advice, like following a rule, you may use must or mustn't. And if you're giving advice for a very particular situation, you may say had better. It usually means if you don't do this, if you don't take my advice, something bad will happen. So when you tell someone they had better do something, or they'd better do something, you're telling them that is the better decision than not doing anything. And finally, as we've discussed before, we can use the perfect form of modal verbs to talk about regrets in the past. Now let's look at the practice. Exercise 1. You have to choose which option explains the sentence better. For question 1, we'd better not swim here means it is a better decision because if you don't listen, something bad may happen. So we can see it's not a preference about swimming pool, but that it could be dangerous to swim here. Exercise 2. Question 1 says, what do you advise or think I should do? Since the sense of advice is already in the word should, we don't need to use it twice. So the answer should be, what do you think I should do? Exercise 3. You have to complete the second sentence so that it means the same as the first one. Since the meaning in question 1 is, you shouldn't touch the top of the oven or you may get hurt because it's still hot. So the better thing to do is to not touch the top of the oven. So the way you advise is to tell them the better option, which is you had better not touch the top of the oven. We can ask for permission with modal verbs as well. Here are some examples, and among these examples, Might is the most formal, but it's also old-fashioned. If you want to sound polite, it is more natural to say, "Do you mind if?" "Is it alright if?" And casually, "Is it okay to do something?" The modal verb can describes ability, and when you do not have permission to do something, it is like you do not have the ability to do so. So we would use can or be allowed to talk about having permission, and the negative form to say that we do not have permission. If the instructions are written or you wish to sound more formal, it's common to use may or may not as well. For permissions in the past, we may use could or were allowed to. For permissions in the future, simply use the future form of be allowed to. That is, will or won't be allowed to. Now let's look at the practice. Exercise 1. You have to match the photos with the sentences and then fill in the blanks. Question 1 is about food, and the only picture about food is eat. When you go to a restaurant, you can eat, or you are allowed to eat. But most of the time, we can't or aren't allowed to bring our own food. As you can see, can is interchangeable with are allowed to, and can't is interchangeable with aren't allowed to. Exercise 2. You have to decide how formal you need to be. For the first question, A is trying to ask Mrs. Canford a question, but since asking question is not strictly forbidden, there is no need to ask if you are allowed to, and you can simply ask, "May I?" For the next question, might is too formal and old-fashioned. Simply ask with can. For exercise 3, you are proofreading for the correct use of modal verbs. Question 1, as you remember, we always use the base form of verb after modal verbs. So for question 1, cross out to, so that we have the correct form can't smoke instead of can't to smoke. For question 2, the complete replacement of can't is aren't allowed to. So simply add in the word to complete the sentence. Just like we can ask for permission and give advice, modal verbs are very useful in requests and suggestions. The most common ones would be can or will you, or you may use could or would to be more polite. These are the common phrases we can use to make suggestions, but among these options, could and should are used when we are less certain the listener will like the suggestion and take it. Finally, for the word will, it simply indicates a sense of future, and when you offer something, promise to do something, or warn someone that something will happen, they are all in the future, and you may use the word will. Now let's look at the last practice. For exercise 1, we are rearranging words again. Since there's a question mark, we know it's a question, and the way to form a question with these words is, "Can you please turn off the TV?" Remember, TV has to be capitalized and do not leave out the question mark. Exercise 2, you're filling in the blanks to complete the conversation. For question 1, you're making a suggestion, and since the pronoun is already given, the answer is shall. For exercise 3, you have to come up with your own words from the unit and use a different word each time. Question 1 says there's no wrapping paper, so you plan for your next step to get some when you go to the shops. It's in the future, so I will get, or since this is in a conversation, we can use the short form I'll get. Now please complete the exercises in units 49 to 53.